Five must-read classic novels. Classical writings were created 100, 200, and more years ago by authors who lived in other cultural eras for their contemporaries and wrote as was customary then. Classical literature is called from the word classic, that is, simple, which is exemplary reading for all the time, and behind it sometimes ponderous form there are deep meanings and eternal images that are relevant even now. The selected stories by Anton Pavlovich Chekhov. Chekhov is a master of the short form, and it doesn't take much effort to read his stories written in simple and lively language. Chekhov's stories are usually considered funny, and yes, there is something to laugh at, although most of this laughter is pretty diluted with sadness. Chekhov is an ironically sad chronicler of the era, an observant photographer of characters and moods, and a truthful photo rarely flatters its subject. Chekhov's characters are afraid to change, afraid to love. In their world, one can only dream of a bright life and true love, but it's super to hope, and dreams grow smaller over time, and everything is consumed by Philistine longing and grave hopelessness. Second must read classical novels is Charles Dickens. Great Expectations. Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy said, sift through world literature, Dickens will remain. And he didn't give such compliments to just anyone. Charles Dickens is a vivid character, surprisingly close and recognizable even after 150 years. Brilliant humor and a unique ironic writing style and fascinating plots with a pleasant ending. There is something to cry and laugh about, and to do both with great pleasure. I strongly recommended starting with the novel Great Hopes, Great Expectations. The action captures the reader immediately, and the criminal intrigue is not revealed until the last pages. There is a young scamp who suddenly found himself with money and went to conquer secular London and many charming eccentrics. An extra bonus is one of the most memorable female images of world literature, the eternal bride abandoned by an insidious seducer on her wedding day, and aged in her dilapidated estate, sitting for decades in a decayed wedding dress at a banquet table covered with rotten and withered vines, either a ghost from a terrible Gothic fairy tale or a satire on old England. The third must-read classical novel is The Golden Heart by Ernst Theodor Amadeus Hoffmann and other short stories. Everyone knows him by his famous novel The Nutcracker. No melancholy and despondency. Pour a glass of semi-sweet Rhenish. Open the book and embark on a real romantic journey full of extraordinary, fantastic images and amazing adventures. Hoffman is an urban fantasy of the early 19th century. Here, the Prince of Fiery Spirits works as a library caretaker, an evil witch sells apples and pies at the street market. Golden snakes turn into the reflection of the setting sun, and the plot leads us to a wine cellar, then to an otherworldly palace, and all these with intimitable author's humor and romantic irony. The fourth must-read classical novel is The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. A collection of 100 short stories was created by a brilliant Florentine writer in the middle of the 14th century. The beginning is familiar from the time of the pandemic. The plague is raging in Florence, and seven charming young women and three equally pleasant young men go into self isolation in a country house. There they tell each other stories, 10 on each of the 10 days. The plots won't let you get bored. A tragic novel about love in the spirit of Romeo and Juliet, a dramatic story about an abuser and his victim, a drama in the style of the Coen brothers about a guy who came from the village to sell horses and literally fell through the toilet of a hotel in the Neapolitan criminal underground, stories about pirates and the treasures and crooks, and of course, there are a lot of candid stories. And the final fifth must-read classical novel is The Death of Arthur, The Legend of King Arthur by Thomas Malory. Famous novel about knights, written by a real knight. Sir Thomas Malory was just like that, in armor, on horseback, a participant in the Wars of the Roses, many tournaments and raids on other strangers' positions. The end of his stormy life was naturally his imprisonment in the castle, where he was out of an abundance of leisure gathered together and described all the legends about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. King Arthur, the Fairy of Morgan, the Lady of the Lake, the Sword in the Stone, the Holy Grail, Sir Gawain, Sir Percival, Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, enchanted castles, giants and witches, ladies in distress, tournaments, battles, and Avalon all gathered. That's all for these five must read classical novels.